4. The creation of India and Pakistan was not just a historical event, it was one of the most turbulent, bloody, therefore, and chaotic transitions the modern world has ever witnessed. The separation of the Indian subcontinent into two independent nations in 1947 wasn't the result of careful, deliberate planning. It was rushed or hastily executed and filled with consequences that would echo for decades. Initially, the British colonial government had intended to withdraw by the end of 1948, but as tensions escalated and communal violence began to rise, and therefore they decided to expedite the process. The British Raja, which had ruled over the Indian subcontinent for nearly 2 centuries, was collapsing, but it wasn't doing so quietly. Instead of an orderly handover, it became a chaotic scramble to end a long, painful chapter of imperialism. The problem was freedom wasn't the only matter on the table. The moment the British decided to leave, another problem surfaced, perhaps even more dangerous than colonial rule itself: how to divide a nation. As the departure date loomed, or negotiations intensified, the British began talks with Indian leaders, hoping to broker a peaceful resolution. On one side stood the Indian National Congress, represented by Jawaharlal Nehru, a visionary leader who dreamed of a unified, independent India. On the other side was the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a determined man who feared that a Hindu-majority India would sideline the rights, identity, and political future of millions of Muslims. This wasn't just a disagreement over territory. It was a disagreement over identity, representation, and survival. For Nehru, unity meant strength. For Jinnah, unity meant subjugation. The British, caught between these two opposing views and eager to disengage from their colonial responsibilities, eventually supported the idea of partition. Therefore, a new plan emerged: the creation of two separate nations, India with a Hindu majority and Pakistan with a Muslim majority. This decision, and therefore made with incredible speed and under immense political pressure, would tear through the subcontinent like a storm. It wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. It was about uprooting people from homes, dividing families, severing centuries-old communities, and forcing millions to migrate to a country they had never known as theirs. August 1947 arrived, and with it came both hope and horror. Therefore, India became independent, Pakistan was born, but freedom came at a price, one that neither nation was prepared to pay. Within weeks, massive waves of violence erupted along both sides of the new border. Trains carrying refugees were stopped and attacked. Entire villages were massacred, Hindus fled from what had become Pakistan. Muslims fled from what had become India, and in between them lay a trail of blood, broken dreams, and haunting silence. Nearly 15 million people were displaced. Over 1 million lost their lives, it was the largest mass migration in human history, and one of the most brutal. What makes this story even more tragic is how rushed and poorly managed the entire process was. The British, eager to wash their hands of the responsibility, handed over power with minimal preparation. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been to India before, was given the impossible task of drawing the borders in just 5 weeks. 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent, 5 weeks to determine the fates of millions. He worked without proper maps, without an understanding of the local context, and without even visiting the areas he was petitioning. When his line, now known as the Radcliffe Line, was finally drawn, it split communities, rivers, farmlands, and lives down the middle. And once it was published, it was too late to fix the damage. The seeds of division, fear, and mistrust had been sown deep. Even today, decades later, the scars of partition remain visible in the relationship between India and Pakistan, in the memories of survivors, and in the border fences and security checkpoints that separate what was once a shared homeland. But amid all the pain, there is also a lesson. Partition teaches us that hasty decisions made under pressure can have lifelong consequences. That the desire for independence must be matched with responsibility, planning, and vision. And that division, when driven by fear and mistrust, for rarely leads to lasting peace. Today, as we look back on that moment in history, we must honor the sacrifices of those who lived through it. Or we must listen to the stories of survivors, not just historical facts, but as human experiences. And we must commit ourselves to learning from the past, so that we never repeat its mistakes. The story of India and Pakistan's creation is more than just a story of two countries. It's the story of identity, or of division, of pain, but also of resilience. To everyone watching this, thank you. Thank you for staying curious. Thank you for honoring history by learning it. And thank you for remembering that freedom, though precious, is not always painless. And that unity, when possible, must be fought for with courage, not carved hastily in fear. Let us continue to learn. Let us continue to remember. And most importantly, let us continue to ask, how can we in our time build a future shaped by understanding, not division? For India into a Hindu majority Indian state and a Muslim majority state of Pakistan, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, the British civil servant with the duty of drawing up the borders for these new nations, aimed to split the states on religious lines while the millions of Muslims left in India could migrate into newfound Pakistan and vice versa. This, however, did not happen so simply, given the option of choosing either side. Some of the princely states that had previously been part of British India struggled to decide between India or Pakistan. Jammu and Kashmir would be the most notable of these, as the region had a complex religious demographic that made it nearly impossible to pick a side. And this, unfortunately, would not sit well with India or Pakistan. When the partition became official, the ruler of Jammu and Kashmir, Hari Singh, also known as the Maharaja, had at first hoped to maintain his princely state at its own independent entity. This nevertheless would change after only a couple of months. What actually occurred next is hotly debated due to the fact that both sides have vastly differing claims as to how tensions escalated and why. According to India, Pakistan was the clear aggressor. Indian military sources claimed that Pakistan had launched an invasion plan called Operation Gulmarg, in which they intended to invade and take Jammu and Kashmir by force. The operation would apparently involve the recruitment of 20 Pashtun tribal militias to be prepped by mid-September, with the invasion intended to fully begin the following month. Allegedly, the discovery of this entire plan could be credited to an Indian officer by the name of Major O.S. Kolkat while serving with the Bannu Brigade. He was supposedly informed of the invasion by mistake and in turn alerted the Indian officials. However, Pakistan had an entirely different story to tell prior to the outbreak of the war or alleged invasion plan. A particularly relevant region of Jammu and Kashmir was facing its own growing revolt. With the eruption of World War II and Britain's decision to enter it, tens of thousands of men from the region of Poonch joined the fight through the British Indian Army. With their dismissal after the war's end, these troops were allowed to return to civilian life alongside their weapons, which greatly disturbed the Maharaja. Thanks to high taxation and additional discord, Poonch and the leadership of Jammu and Kashmir had already been on uneasy terms, but this would prove disastrous for Hari Singh if the people of Poonch decided to rebel. In response, that July 4, the Maharaja ordered all of the Muslim veterans to give up their weapons, which instantly set off alarm bells for the Muslim population in general within Poonch. As tensions rose, stories diverged again as to what really occurred. According to the Muslim Conference, the Maharaja's army responded to the increasingly rebellious spirit in Poonch by firing upon crowds of unarmed citizens, burning homes, and desolating villages. On the flip side, Singh sources instead say that it was the Poonch militants who became violent and attacked the state forces first. What really happened is not exactly known, but it's clear that by this point in time, Poonch and the Maharaja were as divided as ever. The Muslim Conference responded to the growing threat by informing the Pakistani officials that if they did not step up to protect their Muslim brothers in Poonch, for all of Jammu and Kashmir may soon fall to India. And this assumption wasn't too far off. Maharaja Singh, in contrast, had secretly made the decision to accede to India in the case that a choice between one side or the other had to be made. By now, however, this would be far from a peaceful conclusion. Pakistan was already cutting ties with Jammu and Kashmir in the form of resources and supplies, and the true revolt was building, whether it be because of a pre-planned invasion operation or in response to oppression and violence from the Maharaja's government. Pakistan was on its way to the borders of Poonch. The first significant armed conflict in the region is believed to have occurred at Thora at the start of October, as the rebels began their campaign to take control of Poonch, which they found quick success with. Even without the official support or aid of the Pakistani army by this time, the rebels of Poonch were holding their ground, which subsequently pushed the fearful Maharaja into the arms of India. When Maharaja Hari Singh found his state caught between rebellion from within and pressure from both India and Pakistan from without, his decision would change the course of history. Initially, he reached out to India for military aid to stop the advancing rebels. But India's response came with a condition. Jammu and Kashmir would first to accede formally to the Indian Union. In a moment of urgency, facing internal revolt and the threat of external invasion, the Maharaja agreed. That agreement became the tipping point. With Kashmir now legally part of India, according to Delhi, Pakistan declared the move illegitimate and claimed that India had taken the region by force. Tensions turned into full-blown war. By May of 1948, Pakistan officially entered the conflict, and the first India-Pakistan war over Kashmir had begun. But even before Pakistan's formal entry, the situation was already spiraling. The rebellion within Kashmir was spreading fast. Muslim state forces, therefore, many of whom sympathized with the rebels, began defecting. The region close to the Pakistan border quickly slipped out of the Maharaja's control. As the conflict escalated, Jammu and Kashmir's Gilgit scouts also switched sides, joining the rebellion, handing over crucial northern territory to the insurgents early on. As battles broke out across villages and towns, danger, Uri, and beyond chaos reigned. The early momentum was with the rebels, but India wasn't about to back down. Once the accession was signed, Indian military forces began arriving in mass, with reinforcements pouring in. A stronger front began to form. By the end of autumn, India had enough strength to go on the offensive. A counterattack in the north pushed the rebel forces back from Uri and surrounding areas, allowing India to reclaim some lost ground. Yet the fight was far from over. While India was stabilizing its northern front, rebel advances continued elsewhere. In the south, the front line had been pushed as far as Danger, prompting another Indian counterattack that reclaimed territory and pushed the rebels closer to the border. Still, not every battle went in India's favor, the city of Poonch remained under siege, and attempts to relieve it failed for weeks. Meanwhile, rebel forces took control of more towns, including Mirpur. The front kept shifting, pulled like a rope in a bitter tug of war. Danger fell once again to rebel forces. Only after sustained counteroffensives did Indian troops manage to force another retreat. Up north, the Gilgit scouts and their Pakistani allies were still making gains. They reached as far as Kargil, a strategically vital area. Left came under siege, but the city held firm. Indian forces, mounting an effective resistance, managed to push the invaders back. The fight stretched in the freezing heights of Dras and Kargil, with the front lines constantly shifting, like the mountains themselves were uncertain of where to stand. Eventually, after weeks of desperate fighting, Indian troops managed to break the siege on Poonch. Victory after victory built India's confidence. And yet, while the bullets paused for a breath, the bigger war, the political war, shifted to a different battlefield, the United Nations. Negotiations at the UN began under pressure from the international community. desperate to de-escalate the volatile region. Finally, after months of bloodshed, a ceasefire agreement was reached and adopted on January 1549. The terms were tense and fragile. Under the agreement, Pakistan was compelled to withdraw its forces, while India was allowed to retain a minimal military presence in Jammu and Kashmir to maintain law and order. Though Pakistan had gained control of parts of the territory, what we now call Azad Kashmir, India had retained the majority of the region. But that ceasefire came with a promising a referendum was to be held to let the people of Kashmir decide their own fate. That referendum never happened. The war ended, but the wounds never healed. The casualty count was staggering. India suffered over 4,000 total casualties, with 100 killed and more than 3,000 wounded. Pakistan's losses were even greater. Estimates say over 6,000 soldiers dead and around 14,000 wounded. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire. Families were uprooted. Homes were burned. Lives were lost in the name of flags, lines on maps, and competing ideologies. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is not just the war itself, but that it would not be the last. This was only the beginning of a decades-long conflict that would flare up time and time again through future wars, insurgencies, political upheavals, and bitter diplomatic standoffs. Kashmir, from that moment on, ceased to be a peaceful valley nestled in the mountains. It became a symbol of unresolved pain, of ambition and betrayal, of what happens when hurried decisions replace patient solutions. The battle for Kashmir was no longer just about territory, it was about memory, identity, and who gets to write the history. And so the story continues.